Here is the second video in our series on Marcus's Why Abortion is Immoral. In this video, we're going to be discussing what he describes as symmetries and standoffs that emerge in the debate between the pro-life position and the pro-choice position. Let's take a look at what he means by symmetries and standoffs. So with regard to symmetry, Marcus thinks that there's a kind of symmetry between the pro-life position and the pro-choice position, meaning that they share certain properties in common, and those properties are going to be properties of the arguments that both sides offer. So on the one hand, the pro-life position, oftentimes what you'll hear coming from the pro-life position is an assertion or maybe an attempted argument that's supposed to show that the fetus is a person. Marcus also claims that the pro-life position simply just takes those truths to be obvious, right? It's just obvious that the fetus is a person from conception. And further, that establishing that these claims are true is sufficient to show that abortion is akin to murder, and so it's immoral. On the other hand, the pro-choice side is symmetrical with the pro-life side as well. And so far as proponents of this position, they also either argue or assert in one way or another that the fetus is not a person. And further, just like with the pro-life position, these folk also, according to Marcus, I think that the truths of these claims that the fetus is not a person, those are just obvious too. The way that might kind of go is, well, if you look at a rock or a plant, a tree, those things aren't persons. Likewise, the fetus isn't much different. You might say a tumor is not a person. The fetus maybe isn't all that different from a tumor. It just seems obvious the fetus is not a person. And then, just like with regard to the pro-choice position, these folk will also go on to claim that just showing these things are true, that's sufficient to show that it's not the case that abortion is morally wrong, right? So that's kind of the symmetry involved. And Marcus thinks that a standoff emerges out of this, the symmetry between these different types of arguments presented by both sides. Well, what is the standoff? How are you going to be able to show which side is right unless if you're able to determine whether or not the fetus is a person? So how can we attempt to solve this standoff? You might think that we could appeal to some more basic moral principle or maybe a moral theory in order to justify one's position. For example, we might say that the fetus has a right to life or the fetus does not have a right to life, and then go on to argue for our position one way or the other. But Marcus thinks that neither way we go is going to be obvious that the other side is wrong. So we need to do something even further than just appealing to some other moral principle. So one could try to show that when we take a closer look at our opponent's principle, then it's not as obvious or as plausible as they might have thought. But then that might also work against our own moral principle as well. A closer analysis of one's own preferred moral principle might show that there are issues that we have to deal with. So this is not going to be a fail-safe with regard to how to solve the standoff either. For example, the pro-life position, they could appeal to a moral principle that looks too broad in scope. The pro-choice position might appeal to one that is a moral principle that is just too narrow in scope. So if the moral principle is too wide in scope, this is the pro-life position, then it looks like that moral principle is going to apply to things that we intuitively think it should not apply to. For example, if our moral principle says something like it's always prima facie wrong to take a human life, that looks like it's going to entail that it would be wrong to take the life of maybe my skin cells right now, or maybe a human cancer cell. We don't want to say that it would be wrong to, to eliminate a human cancer cell. So in that sense, the moral principle might be too broad. On the other hand, if our moral principle is too narrow in scope, this is the pro-choice position, then it will not apply to things that we intuitively think that it should apply to. So take, for example, a principle that says it's prima facie wrong to kill only rational agents. If you're a rational agent, then it's wrong to kill you, but it's not wrong otherwise. Well, that looks like it's going to be definitely too narrow, because then it says that it would not be morally wrong to kill a young child or an infant if the young child or infant is not a rational agent. Same thing with someone who's irreversibly comatose, or maybe someone who's experiencing dementia. If these folk are not really rational agents, have this kind of higher order level of reasoning, then it wouldn't be wrong to kill them. And that looks intuitively pretty bad as well. So the standoff is still here. The pro-life position might try to make an amendment to the moral principle. They might argue for something like this. It is always prima facie seriously wrong to end the life of a human. And this does have the advantage of avoiding the previous problem, right? So why is it morally permissible to kill my skin cells? Well, my skin cells are not human beings. Yet, it now appears that there's a further problem. It looks like if that's the kind of the option you're going to take, then you're going to have to face this problem of speciesism. Why should we prefer human beings over any other species? Does it matter how many chromosomes one happens to have? Why is that morally relevant? And further, Marcus does seem to think that there's something intuitive to the idea that a fetus actually becomes a human being through maybe a biological process of some kind. So the proponent of the pro-life position has the following kind of dilemma. Either the notion of human being is a biological category, or it's going to be a moral category. If the notion of human being is a biological category only, well, then that person would need to explain why this category makes any kind of a moral difference at all. Why is it that human beings are so special? And if the notion of human being is a moral category, then it's just not clear how the proponent of this pro-life position is going to be able to use the claim that the fetus is a human being in order to argue for the conclusion in a non-circular way, right? And that's because the very thing that the pro-life position is trying to show is that the fetus is a person. So you can't try to argue for that by already using a premise that assumes that the fetus is a person or is a human being in the moral category. So it looks like either the category of human being is going to be morally irrelevant, or it's of no use to the pro-life position in arguing. On the other hand, the pro-choice position, they might appeal to something like psychology or particular kinds of metacognition or mental states that look like they're really important to what makes a person. But the proponent of the pro-life position will then simply demand some kind of an explanation of the connection between the fact that X is a human being and the fact that X has such and such psychological states. Right? So maybe it is the case that a human being does have these sort of psychological states, but what explanation do we have for the connection between those? Marcus makes the following claim on this point. If one thinks that it's a legitimate philosophical move for the proponent of the pro-choice position to demand of the pro-life position to give an explanation between the biological and the moral categories of what it means to be a human being, then the very same thing should apply vice versa, right? So if the pro-choice position can say this of the pro-life position, then the pro-life position should be able to make the same charge against the pro-choice position. So the standoff is still here. The proponent of the pro-choice position, they might want to try to say something like, well, common sense psychology is a very, very successful thing. So common sense psychology helps us sort of make predictions and determine why people behave they do. It's because they have certain beliefs and certain desires, and this is a very successful way in which we can get around the world. And those sort of things, having beliefs and desires, looks like the only sort of thing that can have that is a person. Fetuses don't seem to have beliefs and desires. You might also think that consciousness might be the basis of, or what certain rights get grounded in. And so if you don't have consciousness in the requisite way, then you wouldn't have rights. So these are kind of options open to the pro-choice position. But Marcus thinks that this is not going to work either. Why? Well, it's because it's just not obvious, according to Marcus, or at least it's a controversial claim, that having rights entails that you must either be conscious or that you must be rational. So he says that it's just not obvious, or at least it's controversial. So if you take a case like the Karen and Quinlan, this was a case where New Jersey Supreme Court ruled that Quinlan did have rights, certain rights to privacy. But it's just not clear at all that in this case of Carrie and Quinlan, where she was conscious or that she had rationality. In fact, we would probably be willing to say she did not have any kind of higher order level of reasoning. So it seems that there's a symmetry here too. The proponent of the pro-choice position lacks the resources, just like in the pro-life position, lacks the resources to argue for their conclusion, and at least in a non-circular way. So, to recap, the pro life position has a problem of bridging a gap between biological human beings and human beings in a moral sense. That was the dilemma that we discussed. And the pro choice position has a problem of bridging a gap between notions of psychological personhood and what kind of explanations are on the offing for moral personhood. Marcus also thinks that people will, generally speaking, just simply accept whichever side they already agree with, right? So if you already think that the pro-life position is true, then you're going to kind of retreat to that issue. Same goes for the pro-choice position. But Marcus thinks we can do something different. We don't have to argue for whether or not a fetus is a person. We can instead look at the essence of killing. We can try to figure out why killing itself is wrong. And that would maybe give us a better solution, according to Marcus. So Marcus says that the problem of abortion is actually far more theoretical than what we tend to think it is, right? And so what does he mean by that? Marcus says, all this suggests that a necessary condition for resolving the abortion controversy is a more theoretical account of the wrongness of killing. After all, if we merely believe but do not understand why killing an adult human being such as ourselves is wrong, how could we ever conceivably show that the abortion or that abortion is either morally immoral or morally permissible, right? So the basic idea here is we're not going to get anywhere by trying to show whether or not the fetus is a person. Instead, we need to look at like, what is it? What's the essence of killing that we tend to think makes it so wrong? That's where he's going to have to give an argument, an abductive argument for why we think killing is wrong. And if we can do that, then that would perhaps provide a way out of the standoff that he's been addressing.